So let's talk about massing an army of battlesuits, pulse rifles, and plasma fire, and how to start a Tau Empire force in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tau, and a few thoughts for getting a force for the greater good onto the table, and hopefully expanding the Empire in the name of the Ethereals or defending the Enclaves. In the video we'll talk over why you might want to start a Tau army, some thoughts with planning a force in general and some first steps towards getting an army together, some potential ideas for expanding an army, and one example of a strong Tau list right now. A whole load to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. First up, why might you want to collect a Tau Empire army in Warhammer 40k? Usually it's between the lore, miniatures, and gameplay. In the background, the Tau are the youngest race in Warhammer 40k, kind of at odds with a lot of the setting, a technologically advanced Xenos who are very bright and ambitious with some powerful weapons, setting out to bring their philosophy of the greater good to the stars and assimilate or liberate other civilized races as part of their growing empire. They've got a caste system, with their fire caste being the military, and a lot of their technology revolves around great big battlesuits, so if you like the idea of manga battlesuits in space conquering their way through Warhammer 40k, then the Tau can definitely give you that vibe. You can either fight for the main empire under the slightly shadowy Ethereals, or the rebellious breakaway Farside enclaves that are carving out their own path for themselves. When they fight, they make fairly pragmatic use of mobile warfare with an emphasis on kills over taking ground, and have the option of fielding a few alien allies and auxiliaries, Kroot and Vespid. Miniatures wise, despite their very futuristic aesthetic, the Tau miniatures are kind of medium aged to an older faction in terms of plastic kits, but in general I think the vast majority of them still hold up very nicely, and most of them tend to have a fair few options within the kits themselves. Tau kits often tend to be fairly generous in terms of a whole load of different weapon or support system options, as well as drones that you can customize in different ways, though there are still a few fine cast resin relics within the range, such as Commander Farsight and the Sniper Drone team. In-game, Tau are famous for being the dedicated ranged warfare faction. They have very little close combat whatsoever and don't have any psykers in their ranks. It means that their shooting phase does have to be really quite powerful to account for the lack of options, and they do tend to be quite mobile as well, with those battlesuits zipping all over the place. In particular, the latest version of the Codex does seem to reward getting up close a bit more than previous versions, perhaps making them a bit more interactive than they've been at the past, where they could have previously been a bit of a gunline faction. Just sit at the back, annihilate your army, and then take the objectives at the end of the game. They've got a few interesting mechanics to play with, Montcar and Cao Yon, which give you big boost at either the start or the end of the game, marker lights to guide your firepower to where it needs to be, and some fairly interesting and powerful leaders in the battlesuit commanders and the Ethereals. For in-game strength, Tau are currently very powerful, I'd argue one of the very top factions of the game despite their recent nerfs. A few of their units were toned down recently, but they still seem to be doing absolutely fine in tournaments. Finally, in terms of real world cost, I'd say that they're a medium cost army in 40k. They're not going to cost quite as much as the really hoardy factions, but maybe just don't have quite the same amount of deals available as things like Space Marines, for example. Overall, there's a lot to like about the Tau. Perhaps one of their biggest criticisms is they just can be a little bit monodimensional with being an only shooting faction, though I would argue that perhaps in their current incarnation in 9th edition it's less of an issue than it's been before. The missions kind of force you to have to go out and take ground from the enemy, and the terrain in their army rules mean that you still have to be at least somewhat aggressive with Tau, and you can't just castle up in a gun line and shoot the entire opponent's army off the board. Still though, it does have the potential to be at least one potential downside. Otherwise though, if you have decided to commit to an army of greyskin Xenos with fancy weapons, there's really quite a lot of research and planning that you can do around an army to get better informed as to what sort of way you want to take it. Picking up the Codex at least fairly early can be quite a decent resource. That can give you the army rules for all the units, as well as a decent amount of background and some miniature galleries. Otherwise, for rules and points, you could think about Battlescribe, Warhapedia, or the Warhammer app. You could potentially proxy and try out things with Tabletop Simulator. That's a Steam game where people have made a whole load of mods for 40k things, so it could be an option to try out an entire army in the virtual world. Most 40k factions have a very decent social media presence. There'll be a Tau Facebook group, Discord servers, and subreddits. Any of those can give you some good support if you just want to ask a few basic questions to current collectors. And of course, there's absolutely tons of content here on YouTube. You can see the army in action on loads of battle reports, I've made a fair amount of Tau unit reviews and tier lists and things on Auspex Tactics myself, and if you want a gaming type YouTube channel that's fairly dedicated to the Tau, you might want to check out Invasive Wargaming. That guy's made a very decent amount of quality content about the new Tau Codex. I'll link that one down in the video description. In any case, after having done a bit of research, I'd probably start out with a small force, potentially a 500 point or 25 power level combat patrol, as that can allow you to get a few initial games in and then start to get a real feel for how the army actually functions. You could certainly pick up the combat patrol box to get started with that, we'll go over that in a second, but otherwise something fairly basic like fire warriors, crisis suits and maybe a battlesuit commander could be a really good start, as well as any fun or powerful units that really inspire you. If the main thing that was drawing you to the faction is just to blast enemy tanks off the table and single shots with huge railguns, then maybe a hammerhead or two early isn't the worst idea. Otherwise, in the planning stage, I think it's worth getting a practice model or two painted up. I'd start with something small, maybe a fire warrior perhaps. In general, I think it's better to try and paint up a couple of basic troops before jumping towards something really exciting like a commander or some big vehicle. That way, if you make any mess ups on the colour scheme, you can think about correcting it later. And I think just in general about what sort of flavour of Tau you want to play. Even within the same army, you can make some very, very different army archetypes if you want to. I'll link my video down in the description as to which Tau sept you might want to choose. Some units just work really well in one given Tau sept, perhaps more than others. Say for example, Borkhan and Storm Surges go excellently together due to having that stratagem to ignore invul saves. Or if you want to spam tons of Kroot, then Dalith is probably the way to go. Perhaps the most common competitive build at the moment is to go really Crisis Battlesuit heavy. Not really a particularly bad thing in my opinion, seeing as they're perhaps the most archetypical Tau unit out of any of them. And I think the majority of strong lists would use at least some. You can take things in very different ways though. You can use a whole load of armour with Devilfish delivering breaches onto midfield objectives, maybe backed up by some hammerheads. You could try some crazy Kroot list with spamming enormous amounts of birdmen. Or take along a support contingent of a whole bunch of bigger suits, say for example multiple Storm Surges. The way the book's set up at the moment, I think it does encourage you to include a few different elements to the army, usually crisis suits as a main workhorse, then add in some Markerlite support, backfield support units, objective takers, and a few other bits. So if you have a very rough idea about what way you might want to take a Tau force, let's talk about actually getting some models. As always, when buying Warhammer models, I would think about various ways that you can do to reduce the cost. You might be able to get your hands on quite a lot of Tau for very cheap indeed with second hand, either eBay, local gaming groups for people selling, or things like that. But if you want some new shiny plastic, then at least a fair chunk of the world has access to discount retailers, often with a decent percentage of savings. For example, Element Games in the UK, which I'll link down in the video description, they usually have 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures. So if you live in the UK, you could get a fair bit of money off just by ordering through them rather than directly through Games Workshop. The link in the video description is an affiliate link as well. It does help support Auspex Tactics and doesn't cost you any more when you order whatsoever. I would bear in mind that there's also a fair few previous discount boxes for Tau, such as the Start Collecting Tau Empire box or the Christmas Battle Force boxes. If you happen to be able to find those in a local gaming store or on sale for cheap somewhere, then that could be a very good way to get into the force. In particular, the previous Start Collecting Tau box was absolutely excellent, giving you Fire Warriors, Battlesuits and an Ethereal. It's pretty much the ideal starter box if you can still find one. Otherwise, I'd be thinking about picking up the Codex. It's £32.50, €42.50 or $55 at the moment. Unfortunately for Games Workshop, it is currently one of the ones that contains the entire full rules for the faction. There aren't any random supplements elsewhere. Though I would bear in mind that the balanced data slate did make a few changes to the book. If you're playing matched play, then it means that the Farside Enclave sept is a bit weaker than it was before. Broadsides are no longer core, and Mod Card doesn't give you the extra AP as well for being up close. You can find those FAQs on the Warhammer community website. Still though, getting the Codex is probably going to be one of the first things that you need to pick up before you think about models. Miniatures wise, you could consider the Combat Patrol Tau Empire box set. That's a pretty nice starter set for £90, $150 or €120. These Combat Patrol boxes usually give a decent discount compared with what Games Workshop sells the kits for separately. So if you are looking to get a few Battlesuits and Fire Warriors on the table for a cheaper price, then I think that picking up this one is a pretty reasonable first move. In the box there's a couple of infantry characters, the Ethereal on the hover drone and the Carter Fireblade for making Fire Warriors shoot better. a squad of Tau Fire Warriors with their drone support, and then battlesuit-wise, the box has a definite stealth theme going on. You get a set of stealth suits, and then the big stealth battlesuit, the Ghost Keel. Overall, I think that the box is a pretty decent pickup. Pretty much all the choices are at least usable in-game. If you're not playing Farside Enclaves, then the Ethereal is pretty much an auto-include. He just gives amazing buffs for his points cost. The Fire Warriors you could build as either strike squads or breachers. The strike squads maybe if you're more thinking about holding home field objectives. Probably the breachers if you're thinking of picking up a devilfish for them, and then zooming them up to midfield objectives. Stealth suits are pretty reasonable as a screening unit, and maybe one for delivering battle suits to the field early. And I'd say the Ghost Kill is kind of okay. You don't seem to see loads of them played in the most competitive lists. Its firepower isn't terrible though, and it can be kind of annoying to shift from objectives. All of this should give you a solid 500 points or so, allow you to get some first games in, and of course you can always expand with other units that you want from there. So the question from there becomes where you might want to expand further from, and out of the extensive Tau roster, these choices will be the units that I'd most consider adding to the current lineup. As I mentioned earlier, Tau Crisis Suits are a really powerful core unit to the army. They're pretty much the most efficient firepower in the book when they're buffed up with commander buffs and marker lights and things, so I'd strongly recommend picking some up fairly early. A lot of newer players probably don't want the faff, but I'd seriously consider magnetizing the weapons on these. As magnetization go, Tau seem almost made for it. All of their weapons tend to attach to various hard points, and it's really quite satisfying to be able to chop and swap gear just game on game if you wanted to try something else out. And if you want some guides on how to do that, just literally just put Tau Battlesuit Magnetization into YouTube, and you'll have your choice of about 10 different guides. To lead the force, I'd certainly be considering a Tau Commander of some sort. Tau Commanders are so good that people often run multiple detachments to allow you to take more than one of them, and they add some seriously powerful synergies to your army, and also are decent sources of firepower in their own right. The Crisis Commanders can allow your Tau to go zooming towards the enemy and not take any modifiers to hit, as well as falling back if you get tagged in combat. Cold Star ones have some crazy movements and can help your Crisis suits to have the same. And they have access to a really powerful damage dealing Warlord trait which allows you to reroll all hits and wounds, so a lot of their guns are going to have their wounds converted most of the time. You can combine that with high output burst cannons, or maybe that prototype system burst cannon to convert lots of hits onto the enemy, or even do that funky melee build that you can do with the thermoneutronic projector and the Onager gauntlet. You could think about adding some other gunline elements. Hammerheads with railguns are certainly really scary. They're going to be absolutely terrifying to any army that has a whole load of armor. Otherwise, you could add a big stompy Storm Surge, which can certainly do a bit of heavy lifting with that crazy damage 12 gun, or potentially a few broadsides, usually with the heavy rail rifles. I think both Plasma and the Smart Missiles are both interesting. Recruit squads and hounds aren't particularly tough, but they can be nice expendable screens that provide a little bit of melee. They at least have the potential to bully some enemy light infantry off midfield objectives if you can get the charge off. Devilfish are a pretty reasonable choice for breachers zooming onto midfield objectives, then use the stratagem to jump out and fry things with close range pulse fire. Stealth suits, as in the combat patrol, can be pretty handy to have a unit or two to infiltrate into the midfield and maybe deploy those battle suits early. And usually at least somewhere in the army you'd want to think about something like a marker light source. Tau shooting is going to be a lot better if you're hitting on 3s rather than 4s, and there's a few different ways that you can go with this, either with drones attached to characters, or maybe picking up entire dedicated squads of pathfinders or marker drones if you want. A lot of stronger lists I think will include multiple elements out of this list that you can skew pretty heavily to one theme if you really want to, say using multiple detachments to spam commanders if you wanted, fielding crazy mass armies of Kroot, or going for traditional Tau power gun line with a whole load of really big guns and not too much else. There's definitely plenty of options, and it's a flexible codex for your own style of play. Finally, let's finish up with what just one strong Tau list at the moment could look like, and this one's a list that goes very, very heavy on the Crisis suit, and it was used by Thomas Ogden to take first at the Dog Invitational GT. The list is made up of a battalion, patrol, and supreme command detachments, all of Tau Sept giving you a single reroll per shooting attack, helping out with auras and command abilities a bit, and giving you an extra +1 to wounds if you use their stratagem to focus down one enemy unit. It's probably the single most competitive Tau Sept right now, and it also comes with a whole load of decent characters attached. There's Shadow Sun, Dark Strider, and Ornvar all in this list. The main core of the list comes in no less than 19 crisis battlesuits, a few of which are bodyguards, and then supported by 5 characters, a couple of broadside gun turrets, and a unit of Kroot. It certainly packs enough firepower to hoover a lot of armies just right off the table, being particularly strong against 3 wound infantry with the sheer amount of plasma rifles that are kicking around. Perhaps the biggest standout feature of the list are 3 big units of 5 crisis suits. Support-wise, they're all set up the same. 2 of the models take a shield generator, 3 take velocity trackers for better hit rolls against fly units, and in the squad there's 2 ablative shield drones and 1 marker drone. One of the squads seems to be set up for close range armor and terminator busting with plasma fusion blaster. One's a pretty long range squad with plasma rifle missile pod that could be good for jumping in and out of terrain at long range and shooting while staying safe. And one takes burst cannon, cyclic ion blaster and plasma rifle, so it can still do a little bit of anti-tank, but it's going to be far better at chewing through hordes. There's also a unit of 4 crisis bodyguards as well. Again, they're a bit more of the anti-horde configuration, with burst cannon, cyclic ion blaster and plasma rifle, plus they can be a bit better for lookouts and stopping enemy direct shooting. That squad also has a marker drone and a shield drone in. They're all supported by no less than 3 different commanders. Commander Shadowsun is the warlord with Exemplar of Cao Yon, allowing you to redeploy a unit pre-game to either get it in a perfect alpha strike position or to pull it back to safety. As well as contributing a bit of fusion blaster fire, she can also allow one of the big crisis squads to reroll all hits. There's then a crisis commander with 2 plasmas and a missile pod and a shield generator. That one takes Exemplar of Montcar. That's one of the best buffing ones for close range crisis suits. One selected unit gets to reroll wound rolls against enemies within 12 inches if you've taken Montcar, so it's another absolutely enormous shooting boost. Then there's a fast moving Cold Star commander. He takes both of the fancy burst cannons in the DW02 burst cannon out of the prototype systems and the Cold Star unique high output burst cannon. Those two together allow them to spam out a whole ton of shots, along with a missile pod and shield generator. He's got precision of the Hunter to reroll all hits and wounds, so he's going to stack some decent saves on just about everything. And also takes the Onager Gauntlet relic, which actually means that his melee is rather threatening as well, due to rerolling all the hits and wounds again. Very dangerous, plus can also use their unique buff to make one crisis suit unit move faster. Then, just to absolutely max out the support, we've got Dark Strider, who can make one unit be +1 to wound against a target. Chipping in a marker light doesn't really hurt either. And Ornvar, the chief of the Ethereals, Sense of Stone for the excellent Feel No Pain buff, Wisdom of Guides to farm out the command points, and maybe could swap out one of them for Zephyr's Grace if it made more sense. Doubling down on durability boosts if it makes sense to, and one unit just really needs to survive. Between all these massive buffing characters, the crisis suits can really go to town. They should usually be +1 to hit from a marker light, perhaps +1 to wound from Dark Strider, or rerolling all wounds, rerolling ones to hit from the various auras, or rerolling everything from Shadowsun. The crisis suit's firepower is already kind of good, and there's a whole ton of options just for taking it to an entire extra level. Finally, to round up the list, there's 2 single broadside battlesuits, each with heavy rail rifles, smart missile systems, and a velocity tracker. A little bit of quality long-range anti-tank, and a bit of ignores line of sight if you desperately need it. And then a single unit of 10 Kroot to fill out the troops requirement for the patrol, and could be good just for holding some objectives or doing a bit of screening. Obviously this one's a bit of a skew list. It's going incredibly heavy on the whole crisis suit strike force dynamic. It's still very possible to make strong tower lists with significantly fewer crisis suits than this. It does seem to be one of the stronger ways to play right now though. In any case, it certainly gives a good idea of how to use crisis suits to the best of their ability, and a bunch of decent setups for buffing characters. So anyway, I think we'll leave that there for today. Hope you've enjoyed a bit of a rundown of some ways that you could think about starting a Tau Empire army. And by all means, if you have further insights, please let us know down in the comments, anything that you think might help out new players. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that Element Games affiliate link, which is down in the video description. If you are looking to pick up some Warhammer kits, it's a pretty decent option here in the UK. They usually give 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, and if you do click that affiliate link before buying anything from them, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics without costing you any more whatsoever. Can just be a way to help out the channel if you were thinking about picking up something anyway. For people over in the USA, I do also have an Amazon link down there as well. Again, that works in much the same way. click the link, buy anything whatsoever, and a small amount goes to help support the channel. Again, can be a good way to help out if you were thinking about buying something anyway. In any case, a massive thank you for listening. Hope you do the greater good or the Farside Enclaves proud, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.